Alrighty, so this is going to be a quick review of um, Code of the Street, Decent Daddy, because we missed it in class last week. All right, so whenever we're understanding how the code operates, we have to understand it in the larger social context. So the code has taken shape in the context of existing structures, so those social institutions that we've talked about, and of course, because of traditions that are specific to the history and culture of the Black community. So some of these traditions date back all the way to slavery, right? And so it's interesting that the code poses a threat to normal traditions, mainstream values, but at the same time, there's two elements of the code that reflect tradition, which are decency and violence. So we'll get into what that means. So when it comes to the role of father, right, this decent daddy, this is a very important role model, right? And because of that, he has a lot of responsibilities and privileges. We talked about this a little bit before, how, he has the privilege, the kind of patriarchal expectations that his wife dote upon him, his children dote upon him. And because of that, he has those kind of privileges, yet at the same time, the responsibilities are the expectation that he will be the financial breadwinner, that he will protect his family, right? So, when it comes to the role itself, it's persisted over time. So through slavery, sharecropping, segregation, industrialization, and beyond. So, it's important to see how this role has shaped the understandings of, masculinity and men within the Black community. And of course, like we talked about before, he's a role model to all kids in the neighborhood, not just his kids, but other kids in the neighborhood that he's going to mentor. He'll often invest time and attention into these kids, and that gives these kids a understanding of what, a positive male role model is, and, something that can be, shaped in their minds to kind of give them a different alternative to the code of the street. And so, in a lot of ways, he feels the burden of race, meaning he feels compelled to be this good man, right? This role model, because he's trying to combat those racist stereotypes and perceptions of Black men, but of course, specifically poor Black men, right? The intersectionality aspect of not just race, but social class and gender. So he has something tangible to offer. That's really important to the effectiveness of this role within the community. So he can often give help to people that need it. Meaning, if someone's looking for a job, he might have a connection for someone that can get them a job or a place to live or something of that nature, right? And so if he sees that others are committed, he will help them and offer them resources. And that, solidifies the importance of his role in the neighborhood. So going back to the larger context, we really need to back up and use our sociological imaginations and understand how the social structures of our society also affect the development of this role. So, in a lot of ways, caste systems are important to understanding the kind of social cultural experiences of African Americans within this culture. So, a caste system is a system of social stratification where some people are locked out of opportunities based on what position they were born into, right? A lot of people think of it as the caste systems within India, right? Like if you're born into a low caste, it doesn't matter what you do with your life, you are in that social caste, right? So it's really a system that's just not going to give you a chance to change your position. You're born into it. And so a lot of people argue that people of color in this country are living in a sort of caste system, right? Not the democracy that's really promised to the rest of us, because there's so many structural and cultural barriers that keep, certain racial groups locked out of the opportunity structure of mainstream society. So another term that can help us understand the larger context of these issues is racial apartheid, which is a system, apartheid meaning separateness, that was the rule until the early 90s in South Africa. So I'm going to show you this quick clip, but really what it illustrates is not just the understanding and history of apartheid, but how apartheid is very reflective of our own system of segregation, Jim Crow segregation, that went on within our country for a lot of years, right? So I'm going to put that clip in here.
Nelson Mandela became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994. It was the official end of white minority rule, otherwise known as apartheid. Apartheid, you've heard of it, but what exactly was it? I'm Francesca Fiorentini, and this is AJ Plus. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word that means separateness. It was a system of racial segregation that governed South Africa for nearly 50 years. It specifically aimed to protect the domination of the white South Africans over non-whites in every aspect of life. But it didn't just appear out of thin air. During the colonial grab for the country between the Dutch-descended Afrikaners and the British, the rights of native black South Africans were sidelined. So when apartheid was officially made law in 1948 by the Afrikaner-led National Party, it was a continuation of injustices already happening. Afrikaners believed that South Africa was their God-given homeland, and that the white race was superior. The black majority was therefore seen as a threat. There were 148 apartheid laws. Blacks had to carry ID permits at all times and had to obey strict curfews. Public facilities were separated for white and non-white use, and marriages between whites and other races were banned. People were classified into 4 racial categories: white, black, Indian, and colored, people of mixed race. And they were all separated into different residential areas. Blacks were divided into 10 so-called homelands based on tribal groups. Homelands were rural, overcrowded, and lacked jobs, forcing blacks to seek work as migrant laborers. Wages were low, and it was illegal for workers to strike. See, apartheid was also economically motivated. A cheap workforce was needed particularly to work in the country's gold mines. Powerful mining magnates had a huge stake in apartheid policies since their profits depended on keeping black wages low. Outside their designated homelands, non-whites had no political rights. Since they were not technically citizens, they couldn't vote. Education? Also divided. The state set up a separate education system for blacks that received a fraction of the funding that white schools did. Mandatory education ended at age 13 and was structured to funnel blacks into menial migrant labor. Exploitation? By design. Needless to say, there was resistance to these insane laws. Protests were often led by black students and youth and were met with severe repression. Out of these struggles came leaders like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, and Walter Sisulu, who would help bring an eventual end to apartheid. So now that you know what apartheid was, could you imagine living under it? Are there any similarly unjust laws that still exist where you live? Leave us your comments below. Peace and reconciliation.
All right, so class mobility is just the ability to move up or down a social class in your lifetime. In our country, it is very difficult for many people to achieve social mobility. So for example, we know education can help you move up a social class because if you get educated, you can get a better job, and the better job is going to come with, more financial stability, which is not just going to affect that individual, but it also will affect their family and ultimately their community. But as we've discussed, there's an issue of inequality in education, right? Some people have more barriers to face in order to get to college, right? They might have a less suited education for higher education because of the school that they went to, because of the social class that they have is related to where you live. Obviously, if you're poor, you're going to live in a poorer area, right? And a reflection of that is that the schools, since they're somewhat based off of property value, also are related to the financial status of the neighborhood. Hence good schools, bad schools, right? And that's a problem because all it does is reproduce social class inequality generation by generation. So if you look at this, how the caste system, the segregating people based on how they are born and not giving them chances to get out of that, right? Racial apartheid, segregating people and defining them as different or less worthy or more threatening because of their race. And of course, class mobility, the larger problem for all people in the society based on their social class. It's very difficult to move up that social class position. So these are some really important factors into what has shaped the identity and understandings of this role and really the code itself. So as far as this, father figure, what does he stand for? Well, he stands for respectability, righteousness, religion, and manhood. So he's typically socially conservative, very independent, strong, religious, and God-fearing. He definitely believes in a very strong work ethic, and that's something that he promotes to all of the children that he comes in contact with. He's typically known by everyone in the community, meaning that he enjoys a certain amount of respect in the community. And it's not just the decent that know him, the street know him as well. So even the most violent people in the community will often treat him with respect, as he's considered something of a public figure. So his success is linked to financial stability. That's an important part of this mix, and this is why Anderson laments the fact that a lot of these role models were diminishing because of the overall financial issues. We'll get to that in a minute. So, because he has, his success is linked to financial stability, he often works more than one job, right? In return, he expects a subservient wife that will not challenge him. That's kind of that patriarchal king of the castle thing we talked about before. And he has very little respect for men who don't honor their responsibilities. So if a man gets a girl pregnant and doesn't step up and financially provide or take care of her, he doesn't think of him as a real man, right? So because he steps up and he fulfills the role of man, he has very little time or respect for men that don't. So in the chapter, Anderson uses Don Moses as an example of this archetype, as he provides for his family, is a positive role model for his children and for others in the neighborhood as well. So he talks about the problem of the diminishing influence of these role models. So very few youth are growing up and having access to these role models or the values that those role models support and teach. And though it's an essential role in the community, not having these role models means that street kids don't even realize what they're missing. And it often leads to a very warped idea of parenting, right? Where those that don't have this role model see the economic part, right? They see that, oh, I'm supposed to provide financial support, but they miss the values part, the working hard, the saving, the religious aspect, right? And that is often what leads to the success, the actual work ethic, the value system. And so not learning that is a problem. So if this role disappears, the street-oriented are then able to set the standards. And this is why, he talks about that changing shift at the time when he was doing this research, that the code of the street was really taking over. So another example he gives in the chapter is Martin Davis, who is a 25-year-old guy who works for a moving company, and he's interested in this girl in the neighborhood named Jolene who has a kid. And, this baby's father that basically stopped showing up and stopped coming around once she was visibly pregnant, right? So he starts dating her and being around for her, and not just for her, but for her son, even though it's not his biological son. And so they do end up, after a while dating, they end up having a child together. And so he sees her regularly and he supports her financially, but he also supports both of the kids, not just the one that's biologically his, right? So Martin comes from a long line of decent families. So this goes on for a while, but then once her original baby's daddy gets a little bit interested, basically he starts to notice again, like, hey, this woman, then basically Martin ends up marrying her, which his friends really didn't support. His friends saw it as a loss of freedom. His friends made fun of him and mocked him about it. But of course, his family was supportive because his family was decent oriented. So it shows how even the shifts were somewhat generational, right? The expectations of the older generation were leaning much more towards decent, and that this tends to get kind of watered down over generations. Another example he gives is Mr. Charles Thomas. So he calls him the image of a strong black father. He's a retired federal police officer, and he's definitely the ruler of his household, right? He's very deeply religious, and it's the saddest thing, right? They talk about how his son was stabbed to death on a dark street, and how he carries the loss it's, and this quote I pulled from the chapter. As a hard man with strong notions of the place of women vis-a-vis men, he is reminiscent of the man of the Old South. So meaning that his value system, while pro-work ethic, very religious, whatever, also has a very patriarchal sense to it, right? That men should be in charge and those kind of understandings that kind of tie back to a more historical nature. So continuing with his story, they talk about the issue of these defiant boys trying to date his daughter. So basically, there's this young guy trying to date his daughter that's more street-oriented. And so, basically he shows up one day and starts flirting with the daughter. And at the time, Mr. Thomas isn't home. So basically, the kid comes inside, kind of makes himself comfortable, whatever. And so the next time the kid shows up, he's already waiting for him on the steps, right? He stops him because the kid just tries to walk right by him, right? And he sees it as not acknowledging his presence or not offering him the respect that he expects from a boy trying to spend time with his daughter. So he tells him, like, hey, you're not going to see her. And he's very clear that, like, he sets the rules for what his daughter does and how his daughter does it. And that, he kind of stops and confronts his kid, like, no, you have to say hello to me. You have to give me the kind of respect that I deserve, or you're not spending time with my daughter, right? And of course, there's this potential for violence. So he knows that often protecting his daughter from these street males that may, because there's this propensity for a lot of the young street kids to get young girls pregnant and then not support them. He tells his wife, he's prepared to fight this kid if necessary to make the point that he is not to be messed with, and neither is his daughter. So there's this interesting part of the chapter where he talks about the hard look, right? And I'm sure if your parents are like mine, you know what that means, right? That idea that, like, sometimes your parents give you that look and you're like, oh, I'm in trouble, right? So there's this situation where he picks up his daughter with his wife from a friend's house, and she's acting super weird, right? She's sitting in the back seat and she's asking to go to the bathroom and all this weirdness. And so when they get home, he tells his wife, she's high. And later, she tells her mom that when they're in the car and he gives her this look, right? Like, you are going to get it. You are in trouble, right? That kind of look that parents tend to give you sometimes to scare you straight. That gaze really made her scared and kept her away from doing those kind of things in the future because she didn't want to have to deal with how her father would react, right? So in a way, it scared her straight, right? She's afraid of having to deal with her dad and those repercussions of, like, being grounded or getting in trouble or getting yelled at or whatever it is. So she refrains from doing drugs in the future. And it has a very impactful kind of teaching moment in her life. All right, so getting back to Michael's death. So the context of Michael's death was that, in the early 70s, gang fighting was rampant, and it was the worst period of gang violence in Philadelphia. And so his son was this high school track star who was a youth counselor at a Catholic church and was like the picture of the decent father's ideal son, right? So he was on a trip on a track meet when a group confronted him and asked what gang he was from. And he basically just got caught in the middle of this stuff where he's like, he's not part of a gang, right? And so because of his youth and, his race and his gender, he got caught by that violence. So, part of this problem too was the community issue of how police are often aware of how this gang violence was going on. So the public perception of those people that were living in poor communities is that police are fine with poor black men killing each other, and that there's little police intervention in this violence. So that creates a lot of bitterness because as many people in the community look to law enforcement for help and they don't see any intervention, they take that personally, right? They see it as an affront to their lives, to their respect, right? That's also kind of where the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement comes from, is this idea of, having to really explicitly say, like, you can't just murder people like dogs in the street. That people do matter, and that's kind of part of where that comes from, this idea that there's a difference between how policing is happening within white communities and communities of color. So, a lot of times even within the communities, because of course there are, people that are poor white people living in these communities, oftentimes police are seen as intervening only when a white person was harmed, which again creates a culture where poor black people feel that no one cares about them, that they're not cared about by police or officials or, generally by law enforcement. And of course, this causes resentment, not just, towards the police, but also, in the larger community starts to feel embittered, alone, abandoned. And that's awful. So when Michael died, it's really sad. Basically, he says he did all he could do as a poor man, meaning he got on the news, he went to the police, he even, tried to go and talk specifically to the judge when someone was charged with his son's killing, but very little was done about his son's death. And this really is hard for someone that spends their life being a decent role model when they're trying to promote the values of larger mainstream society to these young boys, like say, no, just do the right thing and things will work out for you. And then basically when he needs that help, when he's done everything right, and then somehow his, son's death is falling through the cracks, it really embitters him, right? And it's really hard for him. So, continuing with Michael's death, basically, a lot of the chapters about this kind of and how this really destroyed this guy's family, right? So, basically, he goes and argues with the judge about the sentencing of the two boys, right? Basically, one kid held a gun on him and another kid stabbed him. So, the problem that he had with the way that these kids were sentenced is that he argued that if it had been something that happened in a white neighborhood or even farther up the street, then the entire group of kids who were there would have gone to jail. And the reason he thinks this isn't just because of some wanting racial bias. It's actually because there was a case just like his son's case where a cop's son was killed in a similar way, but he was white and the son of a police officer. And the response was everyone in the group went to jail. Everyone that was present there went to jail. Versus in this situation, there's a whole group of kids. None of them go to jail, even as accessories. And the two kids that are charged get very short sentences. And it's upsetting to him. Like, how can you not, this son of his was, his everything. So that was taken away from him. And there was really no, he didn't feel that the judicial system really took it very seriously. So a lot of the problems that come from the code and the reaction to the violence that's already inherent within communities is revenge, right? It's very difficult when you've been slighted and when you feel really upset, obviously emotionally devastated from a loss of someone that you love, that a lot of times people feel the want for revenge. So, even though he's this decent man that was a retired police officer that follows the rules, he wanted to kill those two boys that were on trial for the death of his son. He thought about it. He fantasized about catching them both in the courtroom, making them aware of who he was and killing them both, right? And the only reason he didn't do it was because his daughter talked him out of it, right? So this is a very important part of why do people do what they do? Why does the violence continue? It's because when you're in pain and when you feel like no one else is going to help you out, oftentimes people feel like they have to take the law into their own hands. Of course, it's not a justification at all, but it's a way to understand the motivation of why. So really, his death, Michael's death caused, Mr. Thomas's wife to have a mental breakdown. And, he still financially supported her after she had her breakdown, but he couldn't be with her anymore. So his marriage fell apart because of it. His son and his daughters went through a lot psychologically because of the death of their brother, which irreparably changed his family, right? There's also the issue of Jimmy. Oh, man, that's just brutal. Anyway, this is why I'm like, you should be reading this book because it's so brutal. Basically, Jimmy was present when Mike died, but he ran away when Mike was stabbed. So Jimmy tells Mr. Thomas that he's sorry, and it affected him deeply, right? He feels the guilt of his dead friend. So some people wanted to hurt Jimmy. right, within the community because he ran. And remember, we talked about in the code of the street, you fight, right? What's worse than losing a fight? It's running away, right? You should always stand there. And so, that's kind of what happened with that situation is Mike did stay and Jimmy ran, and largely Jimmy felt responsible for his death. And honestly, he kind of was. Let's be real. It's not just because he ran away. It's because he did not call police or really do anything about it as his friend bled out on the street. So what was really interesting too is that Mike was not a gang member, right? Remember, he was a track star. He was a youth counselor at his Catholic church. He was not involved with gangs at all, right? But the local street kids knew him. The local street gang knew him, right? They respected him. And so even though he wasn't a member, they actually retaliated for his death by going and causing violence against the gang that killed him in the first place. All right, so in conclusion, basically, I'll wrap it up. So the roles of decent daddy and old head are problematic in an economic and social circumstances that is diminishing opportunities, right? So meaning when deindustrialization happened and all those factory jobs left, right, and the economic system changed, this is a problem because if the the basis of the role model is financial stability and you take out the economic floor below all of the people in that neighborhood, that basically means that very few people are going to be able to have that economic stability. So without the economic stability, you have less of the role models. Without the role models, the very community is impacted negatively because those from the street get to dictate what the neighborhood culture and value should be. So, it's important to kind of understand, again, the context, the social context of how, value systems have developed over time. So what's interesting is, there's kind of a generational rift between, Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers, right? There's this idea that this decent image of Martin Luther King and the younger backlash that resulted in the Black Panther Party. I'm going to show you a quick clip about the Black Panthers, but before I do, just a little backstory. I can't help myself. MLK, the way that this kind of decent message of him, he was obviously kind of this role of the decent, right? He provided for his family. He was a very religious man. He had a hard, lots of values and work ethic, etc. But something that we don't know a lot about is just how much he was actually vilified in the time period in which he was, preaching. And after, we all kind of hear those things, especially because now he's taught in schools like the I Have a Dream and all those kind of moments. But what's very interesting is that after that, he turned towards what he called the Poor People's Campaign, right? And towards a sentiment of anti-war in Vietnam. And so this is when he became the most threatening to people, is because he started understanding, not that he started understanding, he already understood this, but he started helping others understand those larger social forces and how they affect people's opportunities. So really showing that, yes, racism is a big problem, and yes, racial bias and discrimination are huge problems that people have to tackle with. But at the same time, social class is another part of that. And he talked about how, without the decent education, without the decent jobs, without any of that, you're not going to be able to lift the community out of this kind of suffering, right? So it's really interesting. Even though we kind of have a squeaky clean image of him now, actually at the time of his death, he was kind of maligned by a lot of people at the time that thought that, his turn towards anti-war, towards issues of poverty was just not something that they supported. So anyway, I'm going to show you that Black Panthers clip right here.
The Black Panthers.
Black Panthers.
The Black Panther Party.
Black Panther movement.
The Black Panthers were absolutely unique.
Being black in America meant that you didn't walk down the street with the same sense of safety and the sense of privilege as a white person. Attack dogs, fire hoses.
Police jump on you, beat you up, put the gun at your head. This is what we were going through on a daily basis.
We stand on the eve of a black revolution, brothers.
Now we have voices within the community that we're not going to continue to turn the other cheek.
We want black power. We want black power.
The Second Amendment guarantees the citizen a right to bear arms on public property.
We're going to carry our guns and we're going to follow the police. We're going to maintain a legal distance, ready to throw down if necessary.
Anyone who would approve of this kind of demonstration must be out of their mind.
God give me some. That's what I need.
These racist Gestapo pigs have to stop brutalizing our community or we're going to drive them out.
The majority of the rank and file are women.
We tried to change some of the clear gender roles. Women had guns and men cooked breakfast for children.
The way we walked and talked and dressed, we were a phenomenon.
The Black Panthers really understood the media. They used us to their advantage.
Chairman of the Black Panther Party, and here he is.
They tapped the phone. The phone is probably hooked up to the White House.
You read the Black Panther Party newspaper?
Yes, I do.
Why?
Because I'm black and I'm proud.
The FBI wanted to destroy the Panthers.
How about justice? Justice is incidental to law and order.
This was all-out attack on the Black Panther Party. Every significant office is going to be raided, bombed, shot, mass arrests.
They were coming to kill us.
When the 15-minute gun battle was over, 2 Black Panthers were dead.
This was obviously a political assassination.
It was like a slaughterhouse.
We were doing fundraisers at places like Jane Fonda's townhouse so that we could raise money for the Legal Defense Fund.
There were 156 not guilty verdicts. It was astonishing.
We don't hate nobody because of their color. We hate oppression.
We refer to ourselves as the vanguard. We wanted the entire community to follow.
I felt free. I felt absolutely free. You understand? That's what I feel.
Okay, so another quick thing before I get into the factors, going back to the civil rights movement, is just the issue of de facto segregation, right? This is something that has a lot to do with the code of the street that we've been talking about. But the fact that the past inequalities, meaning redlining, ghettoizing areas, making it so that people of color were literally not legally allowed to live in the suburbs, made it so that people had little escape, little hope, and they got hyper-concentrated in areas of extreme poverty and marginality. And that obviously affected people's opportunities. Okay, so anyway, when it goes back to the factors undermining traditional role models, if the role is dependent on financial stability, the fact that jobs have left means that there's now this economic vacuum. So even most decent have less stability than their parents or grandparents. And so the larger economic things that we can't necessarily control, right? It's not a measure of getting a job or getting another job or getting 3 jobs or 4 jobs. It's a measure of whether or not those jobs are actually going to support your family based on the kind of education and level of skill that you've been afforded due to your background. So the financial problems beset this and really chip away at those very fundamental role models that could otherwise offer support. And like I said, even most decent have less stability than their parents or grandparents. We're moving backwards. And this is something that, while this affected people in this low-income area in the early 90s, this is now the reality for mainstream, basically everyone, for millennials, right? You have less economic opportunities than your parents and grandparents. This has a ripple effect throughout society. So this is an important factor to understanding why the street-oriented are winning over in the ideology and the hearts and minds of people within these communities.